Hello, everyone. I'm Cyrus Webb, and welcome back to Cyrus Webb Presents and Conversations Glad you all could join us for those tuning in on the radio dial in Mississippi at Max WYAD 94.1 FM and WYADonline.com. We're glad that you all could be with us. Also joining us through our podcast at iHeartRadio and Amazon Music. Glad you could be with us. We also are simulcasting our conversation today, so we welcome those tuning in on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, X, and on Instagram. We're about to connect also with our friends on Amazon Live, and we'll get started here. And we're live now on Amazon Live for this episode of Cyrus Webb Presents and Conversations Live. I'm excited to welcome journalist and best-selling author John Lechner to our broadcast today. John is celebrating his newest book, Death is Our Business. You guys can see it there. The subtitle of the book is Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. As you guys can see on Amazon, it's already a #1 new release. I was just congratulating him on that. We'll talk to John not only about the writing and research of the book, but what he wants us as readers to be able to take away from it. For those of you who are joining us on Amazon, you'll notice the book either on the side of us or down below. You can go ahead and be able to get your copy of it, either the hardcover or the Kindle edition as well. If you guys have any questions for John, make sure you guys do put those in the chat. We do have the chat open on all the platforms. But John, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it.
And thank you for having me.
I'm glad to do it. ESP Presents over there on IG. I see you. Glad you could join us live. So, John, you've been doing a lot of conversations about this book, and I was fascinated as I was prepping myself after reading it that there's so much I did not know. Of course, you have immersed yourself in this world, and especially in your journalism. What has it been like for you to see the interest in not only the conversations about Russia and Ukraine that are so much in the news, but also about the groups that these countries use when it comes to warfare?
Yeah, that's a great question because I first started going to the Central African Republic, which is a aptly named country that is right in the middle of Africa, the poorest and least developed country in the world, but in so many respects, my favorite and a place that's very near and dear to my heart. But the Wagner Group, the Russian private military company, first touched down there in 2018. And for me, as someone who's passionate about languages, history, and culture, who had spent a lot of time in Africa and had lived in Russia, this was just interesting for me intellectually, just to see how is it that these kind of two societies that I'm very interested in, two very disparate societies, how are people coming together, interacting with each other, adapting to each other's presence, or not? And so I first started arriving in the Central African Republic in 2019 when, Wagner, Russian mercenaries was still like a very niche topic. I think there were, some people, some journalists, especially, and foreign policy nerds who were interested in it, but I was not expecting, kind of over the years as I studied what was going on, and I went to more and more places, working in Mali, where Wagner operated and operates today, Libya, Syria, Serbia, and ultimately, kind of as we were talking about in Ukraine on the front lines, where this Russian mercenary group all of a sudden kind of exploded onto the international stage, and its founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, became sort of a household name all around the world for certainly a period of time before his death. Mm-hmm. So that was very odd to be kind of caught up in the middle of a developing story from kind of something that was relatively unknown to all of a sudden being the person who has talked to these people when everyone wanted to know what was Wagner thinking, why are they in mutiny? And so very surreal to answer the question.
Yeah. John, I will say, as you were just talking, I was replaying some of the things I remember from the book. And one of the things, as you were talking, I thought about what I think this book does, especially with the subtitle Russian Mercenaries and the New Era of Private Warfare. And this comes up even in your reporting in the book. For them, a lot of them, this was just a job. They didn't think about it in the way that we on the outside look at what they're doing. How can you do something like this? How can you do something like that? To them, it was a way of getting paid. And it was a way of being able to, to basically to take care of themselves. that simplistic nature of it, was that surprising to you, or given the circumstances of what you saw with Wagner and other groups, did it just seem like something that you were expected?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was also a motivating factor, especially when I started spending a lot of time in the Central African Republic.
Hmm.
There were kind of these greater narratives of how Wagner was being portrayed in the media as sort of these uh, omniscient kind of super villains who are in control of everything that's going on, and when you're on the ground, it's a bunch of guys who look like me with pot bellies, and you're just kind of wondering like how could you uh you know how can you reconcile those two images, and this is not to kind of diminish the the role that they have played, and often
Sure.
like a deleterious role, and the violence that they have committed. But you're right, when you get to meet these guys on and talk to these guys on an individual level, you do realize that first of all, mercenaries have been around forever. I mean, as long as civilization has existed, there are people who fight for money,
Hmm.
or goods or prestige, or what have you.
Right.
Um, and that, I mean, to for the most part, every society has a version of this, and so for the most part, the guys who comprised Wagner were veterans of the Russian military. They got out. They, you know, they didn't enjoy being kind of a Russian version of a mall cop, providing security at grocery stores. They missed sort of the comrades at arms that the military provided, the sense of sort of security and fulfillment. Many of them had kind of minor brush-ins with the law, and the money that was also being offered, especially in a Russian context of about $2,000 a month, what was pretty good. And so, these are kind of what attracted these guys. And I think for me, kind of being able to go out there and meet with them, I could see um, how a lot of those kind of motivating factors are some of the same motivating factors of why veterans will join other private
Hmm.
security companies or private military companies across the West as well.
Right. And I love the way that you just said that, John. In that, I think a lot of times the perception and reality are sometimes different. I'm curious for yourself, when you went into this book, what made you want to focus in, when you're thinking about the conflicts you've seen? What made you want to focus on mercenaries and the role that they played?
Oh, that's a good question. I think what is fascinating to me is uh, was that mercenaries sort of thrive in ambiguity. I mean, um, especially in the modern context, right? Where especially Wagner Group, it's part arm of the state, but also part individual commercial enterprise. It leveraged the state, the Russian state, for resources, but also could not have existed without the ambition of its founder Yevgeny Prigozhin. And they operated in this kind of very gray zone, always straddling the two. And I think those types of entities become a very interesting window into kind of the broader structures of the conflicts in which they're operating. And so Wagner and how they were working on the ground became a small window into how these larger conflicts, what's occurring in these larger conflicts. And as you know, Wagner, and they're all detailed in the book, Wagner participated to one extent or another in some of the most, pretty much, close to most of the major kind of conflicts that are making headlines today, whether it be Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, Libya, the Sahel in Mali, Central Africa. And so they were a window into this world.
I want to share something from the book you made me think of as you were talking, John. I want to say again for those who are just tuning in, welcome. Make sure I'm not missing anybody here. Hey, Leslie. Leslie's joining us over on Instagram. Glad to be able to see you, Leslie. We do have a statement from Ellen also on Instagram. I want to make sure we bring up. I want to say for those who are just tuning in, welcome. You all are watching Cyrus Webb Presents or listening to Conversations Live, our radio audience. We're excited to welcome journalist and best-selling author John Lechner to our broadcast today. His book is called Death is Our Business, Russian Mercenaries in the New Era of Private Warfare. You all can get the book here on Amazon, either in hardcover or the Kindle edition. It's a #1 new release there on Amazon. You guys can see. For those joining us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, you guys will find the link with this broadcast. Those on X, you'll see it in the comment section. We have John tagged there on X too. And on Instagram, you can be able to find it in my stories. But we're talking with him about the book and some of the mechanics of it. I want to share something from part 5 of the book, John. And as you were talking, I thought about it because, again, as you mentioned, and I alluded to as well, a lot of us heard about the Wagner Group because of what was happening between Russia and Ukraine. But in part 5 of the book, Liberators, you talk about how, especially after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the role that Wagner was playing there too. And I thought it was really interesting when, as you were talking, I thought about it. I just want to read a bit of this as you write about it. You say in 2021, waxing fear of Wagner coincided with the waning threat of jihadist terrorism. The year prior, the United States began further drawing down troops from Iraq. ISIS, or at least its terroristic caliphate, had been defeated. The Biden administration then committed to a chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. The pivot to Asia was underway. Great power competition, the strategic rivalry between the United States, China, and Russia had taken center stage. And then, as you're talking about that great power competition, you said that Wagner benefited perhaps most of all. Do you think that was something that was not seen at the time, John, that the role that mercenary groups like Wagner would play, especially as the United States was being more or less active in other places?
Yeah, so I think, again, what was interesting about Wagner in particular, and Yevgeny Prigozhin was so useful because he was such a spectacular, outlandish example of this, is that and I think I mentioned it somewhere as well in the book, that ultimately like geopolitics do not kind of descend upon us ex machina, right? Politics in general, and geopolitics too, is created by people, and policies and greater trends are sort of the sum product of all of these individuals coming together and lobbying for their preferred policies or outcomes. And very often those preferred policies also kind of coincide with what is most profitable to them financially or politically. And Prigozhin, as you see with Wagner, was what I call kind of a security entrepreneur. And the best way to lobby for your preferred policies is through narrative. And so politics is sort of a process by which politicians and the people that they're speaking to are creating and responding to these greater narratives and positioning themselves within kind of opposed to or within kind of the greater narratives. And nothing is more of a kind of more salient than these greater threat narratives as well. And so what we have seen is kind of these overarching political geostrategic narratives. In the following World War II, during the Cold War, primary motivating geopolitical narrative was the threat of communism and the necessity of containing it. And so, and for the Soviet Union, the opposite. And so leaders in Africa and elsewhere would position themselves in a way that they could benefit from these threats, either kind of posing themselves as a bastion of anti-communism to get support from the United States, or the opposite, to get from the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
As the Cold War came to an end, as the Soviet Union collapsed, internally, there was this sort of period of really kind of sort of the United States wasn't quite sure what its role in the world was going to be. It found itself again after September 11th with the rise of the jihadist threat and the need to combat terrorism wherever it may be to protect the homeland. And I think that narrative now is slowly going away after kind of the overhang of nearly 2 decades of the global war on terror. We're seeing the rise of China and especially Russia in Europe as these great kind of geopolitical rivals, and sort of a renewed Cold War 2.0 that we call great power competition, perhaps because there's kind of multiple powers to contend with. And for Prigozhin, this was an incredibly profitable environment to be working in, because he was able to sort of sell what he wanted to be these profitable kind of interventions, especially in Africa, where they were involved in gold mining and providing security. He was particularly good at selling back to the Kremlin, to Vladimir Putin, what Russia's interests, why Russia should be in these places. And it just so happened that he was also going to profit from the Russian state's presence in these areas. And Prigozhin is no, he certainly was uncouth and again, kind of a spectacular example of this, but on a much more subtle level, all security entrepreneurs are involved in this sort of narrative creation of creating what their country's interests abroad are and should be.
Right. And I want to get into the role of journalists here, like yourself, John, and what you talk about in the book when it comes to making sure that these things are not going unreported. I do want to say hello to Jesus Blackman there on Instagram. Leslie says hello to you, John. Also, and Ellen was saying that when she hears the word mercenary, yes, she normally just thinks about killing too. I think that's the thing. I think this book really does such a good job, John, of being able to help us not only to think more about words we hear and may even say, but also the roles that those individuals play. And that leads me to journalism, because you talk about throughout the book, not only, of course, just about yourself, but also other journalists that were covering these areas that you were in. I know in talking to journalists over the years, they try not to become the story. Sometimes it's not easy to do. What was it like for you to see that the role that journalists have played, the instrumental role that journalists have played, to make sure that not only individuals are informed, but also people feel like they have a voice?
Yeah, and I think, it's a great point. I think one of the things that was interesting is that the journalism around Wagner, and especially in the Russian media, in the Western media,
Hmm.
ironically played kind of what was a positive thing for Prigozhin, because it allowed him to again sell back to the Kremlin, like, look how well I'm doing over here in Africa. Look how disturbed the West is at what I am doing. I'm a thorn in their side, and therefore, again, I should deserve kind of more subsidies. So, kind of ironically, in a way, Western media actually made Wagner more powerful than it actually was. Because again, when you look on the ground, and this was, I think, one of the central themes of the book. Really, especially in all of these places, Wagner was also being taken advantage of by local power brokers. I mean, whether it's the Assad regime in Syria, which until quite recently was in power, whether it was the regime of Bashir in Sudan, or the Central Africans themselves, who are either fighting against or fighting with Wagner. It's the locals on the ground who have the agency, and Wagner was constantly facing obstacles and challenges as it was trying to go about whatever objectives it was seeking to achieve. And so very often they had to adapt to the environment in which they were in. And I think this is something that should have been quite easy for folks in the West to understand. I mean, if we just take, for example, the United States, basically all metrics, is the most powerful country in the world. And speaking we as the United States, we were not able to achieve what we wanted to achieve in Afghanistan, which is, by a lot of metrics, one of the absolute poorest countries in the world. And so the people who are from these places have an incredible amount of power, of choice, in how to deal with these intervening forces. They might not always have the same access to resources,
Right.
and those relationships might still be incredibly unfair and uneven, but people are still able to make choices in terms of how they interact, and they can make these interveners' lives a lot easier or a lot harder, depending on what they want to do.
Right. And I think, again, that's why this book is timely. But also, I think to have someone like you that's literally been on the ground, John, to be able to share this information, I think is so valuable for us. For yourself, I'm curious. Death is our business. You spend a lot of time in being able, as I mentioned earlier, in being able to share the history and also reporting. What was your hope for our readers like myself? What did you hope we take away from the book that we would then be able to add as part of the dialogue?
Well, that's a great. We talked about it a little bit earlier. I think right before we went on. I think, again, some of these places for me are just so fascinating in and of themselves, and I don't want them to be only fascinating to people because the Russians are there. And so the Central African Republic, for me as a linguist, someone who loves cultures, there are 80 languages spoken there. There's this incredible diversity. People are incredibly resilient in how they navigate kind of a system of governance that is very different from our own. And there's so many things that are going on there that are completely independent of Wagner's presence or not. And so my hope was, too, through the book, that I could introduce readers as well to some of these places that do not necessarily get a ton of coverage. When the Central African Republic shows up in an article, it's really about Wagner. It's very brief, and to the extent I could, I wanted to give people a taste of the rich history of these places too, so that they could understand how Wagner is a piece of the puzzle, but not the puzzle itself. And Wagner was not the catalyst for any of the wars in which it was participating. Mercenaries are a symptom of conflict, right? They're not the disease. They're not the disease itself. And so it was a chance for me to introduce to readers who might not usually read about it the complex histories of Ukraine, Syria, Sudan, Darfur, the Darfur crisis, the Central African Republic, the Sahel, Libya, and all of these actors.
Well, you did a great job in being able to bring it to the forefront, and also I think to do it in a way that helps us to better understand. John, we'll say one last thing. One thing that I also took away from this book is the world's a lot smaller than we realize sometimes, because these things that you write about are not so far from us. And
Yeah.
I think, to show that, how we all are connected by this, which is why it's so important to have books like this to help to share what is happening in the world. And so that we also don't lose sight of that too. Again, everyone, journalist and best-selling author John Lechner has been our guest. Death is Our Business is his new book. Again, you guys can get the hardcover here on Amazon for $29.99, or you can be to get the Kindle edition there for $9.99. John, great conversation with you. How can our audience stay connected with you?
Sure. Well, and thank you again. You can reach me on Twitter at John Lechner1. You can also reach me on Instagram at John A. Lechner. And then I'm on LinkedIn and also my author website, johnlechnerauthor.com.
Awesome. Well, definitely looking forward to having you back, and continued success with the book, John.
Thank you so much.
More than welcome. And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Cyrus Webb Presents and Conversations Live. Until next time, you all make it a great one. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.